and we can get started. So welcome everyone tonight or this morning, wherever you are in the world today. We have a webinar entitled Digital Approaches to Improving Food Safety and Reducing Food Waste. So to start us off, we will have introductory remarks by the Executive Director of the Walmart Food Safety Collaboration Center, Will Watts, followed by a program or project overview by Professor Ralph Christie and our research collaborator, one of our research collaborators in China, Dr. Joel Lee. We will then follow with 3 sessions, each on a different topic, and we will introduce those as we go. So without further ado, I hand it over to Will.
Thank you so much, Lean. Thank you to our host, to all of our friends in the United States, good evening. To our friends in China, 早上好. That's the world we live in when we cross borders with these types of digital events. But as Lynn said, I'm Will Watts, Executive Director of the Walmart Food Safety Collaboration Center. And on behalf of the Food Safety Collaboration Center and Walmart.org, I want to thank our host and just express our excitement about this webinar and the work that Cornell is doing. When Walmart and the Walmart Foundation set up the center in 2016, we wanted to focus on food safety solutions that address these systemic issues, and to do that through collaboration. And really, Cornell and their partners for research embodies both this focus on root cause issues, as well as this collaborative approach. As a retailer, as a center that works a lot with different members of industry and researchers along the supply chain, we can all see that there's mounting strains on global supply chains due to the continued impact of COVID-19 variants, geopolitical events, and environmental pressures linked to climate change. And all these things make supply chain resiliency a concern of governments, industry, and consumers alike. Really, supply chain resiliency is turned into a buzzword, call it robustness, resiliency, but it's something that really is at the top of the mind of so many people who ultimately ensure that food gets on those shelves and give consumers access to it. So the tools, models, and insights that will be discussed here today will not only enhance safety, but also contribute to more efficiencies along the supply chain, and by extension, help address that robustness of supply chains for fresh food in particular. Though we couldn't have predicted these challenges that we now face, or the food system now faces today, when the Walmart Foundation first funded this research back in 2019, it is heartening to know that we are contributing to work that has only grown in importance over what is, I think everyone can agree, are 2 tumultuous years. As the center looks to our future, we're taking a more holistic view of our work, aligned with the realities of today's food system and the priorities of governments, industries, and consumers. A view that increasingly integrates food safety, sustainability, and health and wellness. The great work you'll hear about today aligns with this direction while marrying food science, economics, as well as technology to address the exponential complexities and mounting pressures that we all face when it comes to the food system. If fully realized, the practices examined and piloted in this work could prove to be a step change. We really believe that, and how all of us along this long supply chain manage the flow of goods and ultimately optimize shelf life and safety for our consumers. So as with all of our work, whether at the center or with Walmart, we like to emphasize or think about, what does this mean to the consumer? And I think there's a great deal, as you'll learn from the presentations today, that while we'll talk about, again, the science, the economics, and technology, there is a real human benefit. There is a huge public health benefit to this and a huge benefit to consumers. So always keeping the end in mind. I'm super excited to hear from the experts today and learn along with all of you the latest results and insights from this great work. So with that, once again, a big thank you from the Walmart Food Safety Collaboration Center and Walmart.org. 谢谢大家，谢谢 Cornell 大学，还有谢谢我们的合作伙伴. So with that, I will turn it back to our hosts. Thank you so much, Lynn. 谢谢大家，谢谢 Cornell 大学，还有谢谢我们的合作伙伴. So with that, I will turn it over, turn it back to our hosts. Thank you so much, Lynn.
Ralph?
Ralph, you need to unmute yourself.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ralph Christie. Wherever you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, ni hao. I'm very delighted to welcome you all to this wonderful webinar on food safety and food waste. Food safety and food waste is an essential component of food security, and as the world's population becomes more urban, we realize that transportation, value-added processing, wholesaling, storage, retailing, all of that are critical steps along the supply chain. And at each step, this question of safety becomes important and critical. The purpose of this webinar is to showcase some of the research that's a part of a Walmart Foundation project entitled Food Security Strategies for an Emerging E-commerce Economy. And the overall, our overall arching purpose of the project is to really create new models of engagement, identify new ways of reducing food and making food generally safer. To accomplish this goal, we first needed smart partnerships, particularly smart partnerships between the industry and the scientists at the university. It is in this regard, I'm so very happy that we partnered with Shimei Agricultural Science and Technology Company, a leading organic food company in China that has had strong relationships with Cornell dating back well over a decade now. Dr. Joe Lee, who will provide remarks in a few minutes, is here to represent the company. And you will see that the success of this partnership is largely hinges upon our ability to work with companies like Shimei. Building on this smart partnership, in this webinar today, we will introduce novel models and new approaches to food security, abilities to predict where food may spoil or waste, and improve upon techniques that are heretofore traditional. We rely on our senses of smell and taste and judgment about food quality, but developing models that allow us to predict this and get ahead of the curve, I think is critically important. The good work of my colleagues, Renetta and Martin, and for this has been just a love of labor on their part. And I think that you will enjoy learning some of the advances in which they will share with us later this evening. In closing, I just want to thank all of you for joining in. I want to call your attention to yet another workshop or webinar we plan to do perhaps in the fall of the year that will speak to management and policy questions. And I also wish you an enjoyable evening as you tune in to some of this breathtaking and scientific breakthroughs that our colleagues will be sharing. Thank you very much.
Joel?
Yep. Hi, everyone. It's so glad to, really appreciate the opportunity to join this webinar. I'm so glad to, see you, especially after the long COVID, right? So I'm today, representing the company, Chime, and so our company was founded in 1999, and since the start, we mainly focus on the organic farming, food processing, research development, and also supplying food to the consumers. So our company model is environmental protection is our responsibility, and the food safety is our mission. So since the start, running the business on the business side is one part, but also we really are thinking about the social responsibility. So I mean, we were always, feel really proud, like we are doing our business, but same time, we can help the farmers and also the consumers. Like in China, because agriculture is very special, it's not like in US, very large scale. So there's a lot of farmers involved inside. So I think, like for this project, for sure, like it's really from our side, like it's really, like benefiting each party. It's help our company, it's helping the farmers, and also help the consumers. From the company side, we, like for sure, like when we are, save the, reduce the waste, and also like improve the food safety, that's for sure, like better for the company from the production, also from the image side. For the farmers, it's a lot of work for the farmers to really grow the produce and get it to us, and we then deliver to the market. I mean, this for sure, like will, really there. It's not only about, like reduce the waste for the produce, right? It's also reduce the waste for their contribution. The same time, I think the consumers really benefit a lot, because the food safety is always, I mean, the people are, it's one of the thing, right? Like people have to face every day, and the fresh produce, that's the part, like it's really hard to control. We have, like the, not from us, right? But everyone, I think, have this concern. I think for this project, it's really helping to solve that issue and help on the situation. So yeah, like I mentioned, we really appreciate, we have the chance to be the part of the project. So the right now, I mean, in China there are some study, but I think, like I would say, like still like in US or like like in US, I think the supply chain management is more advanced. The reason I think is because I think like in China right now, like the temperature control supply chain, right? It's just developed in recent years, but like in US has been for a long time, especially for the fresh produce. We can see like a lot of these products are nationwide, right? So distributed. But in China, these are like more newer in recent years. So I think, like they are definitely like more, like how to say, like this, build up from the supply chain in the US, especially Cornell, I think, like represents the advanced technology and also the research aspect on it. So we were really proud, like I'm glad can be part of the project, and we wish, like we can work together and help on this situation. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Joel. And now we begin our first session, Introduction to Microbial Food Safety with Professor Martin Wiedmann.
Thanks, Lynn. So what I'm going to do today is sort of introduce the topic, but also then start to transition into new approaches to control food safety and reduce food spoilage. Both linked together by being two central parts of food security, but also being two central expectations of our consumers. As Joel pointed out, it's the safety and the environmental sustainability stewardship, whatever name you chose, and food spoilage and food waste plays a key role. So let's first talk about food safety. In the world, food safety issues, microbial food safety issues, foodborne illnesses are expected or estimated to affect about 600 million people a year, with more than 400,000 cases resulting in death. If you look in a country like the US, we talk about 1 of 6 Americans contracting foodborne illness each year. And these numbers are probably fairly similar throughout the world, with about 3,000 deaths per year and about more than 120,000 hospitalizations a year. So this is a substantial public health impact. And the group of organisms, the organisms causing these foodborne illnesses, represent a wide range, from bacteria to parasites to viruses. which brings up one initial challenge is we simply decide what to focus on. What are the major organisms of concern? As we try to identify the specific foodborne pathogens and foodborne illness of concern, there are different ways of how to look at it. We can look at it in terms of the total number of illnesses caused per year. In many countries with this, norovirus will probably end up to be number one, followed by salmonella and some of these other organisms. These are US data, mainly to illustrate. Or we can look by the number of severe illnesses. In this case, salmonella becomes number one. E. coli now shows up. Or we could classify and determine the most important organisms by number of deaths per year, in which case salmonella is number one, and now we see Listeria monocytogenes show up as number three. If you look at it combined and mainly focus on a measure of foodborne illness that's called DALY, so disability adjusted life years, which really takes into account illness, severe illness, as well as death. However, interestingly enough, the group of organisms that are the major concerns and have the major public health impact across the world, according to WHO, tends to be non-typhoidal salmonella, so salmonella, Campylobacter, and in some cases enteropathogenic E. coli. So salmonella is a major food safety issue worldwide. However, when we look at different continents and different subgroups within different continents, so the two columns here for Africa represent two different regions of Africa, America is separate into three different regions, you can see substantial differences in the global burden of foodborne illnesses. Measures this, again, this number of disability adjusted life years per population of 100,000, whereas Africa and Southeast Asia estimated, and I emphasize estimated, to have some of the highest foodborne illness impacts. If you look at the organisms here, the red is these non-typhoidal Salmonella enterica, which, as I mentioned before, seem to have the largest impact in terms regard to foodborne illness globally. One of the important things also to remember when we talk about foodborne illnesses, many of them disproportionately impact children under the age of 5. One of the reasons why this is such a concern. So this shows the age distribution and the proportion of illnesses affecting these children under 5, where you can see for some of the parasites that are listed here early on, sometimes it's almost 80% or more of the illnesses that are in children. Even if you look at organisms such as, Salmonella typhus, 30%, 25 to 30%, Shigella species, even there it's about 60% of cases are in children under the age of 5. So now another thing that, while it has not impacted the number of foodborne illness, but it has impacted how we understand foodborne illnesses, understand sources of foodborne illnesses, and how we identify and detect outbreaks, is new technology. And one of the key technologies that has changed how we recognize foodborne disease outbreaks is whole genome sequencing, which is essentially an extremely powerful DNA fingerprinting method. It's been started to use routinely in the US at this point for almost 9 years, but similarly in China, this whole genome sequencing is routinely used, as is it in many other parts of the world, to characterize many different types of foodborne pathogens, Listeria, Salmonella, and E. coli. This graph illustrates the impact of these new technologies with regard to recognizing foodborne illness outbreaks. So this is one example, and these are the number of listeriosis outbreaks from 1983 to 2015, so 2-3 years after implementation of whole genome sequencing tools. What we can see here is that in the early years from 1983 to 1997, we would see or identify one outbreak every 3 years. From 98 to 2013, this was about 2.3 to 2.6, so around 2.5 to 3 outbreaks per year. So 10 times more outbreaks detected. Why was that? Because we started to implement DNA fingerprinting tools to detect outbreaks. Initially, not whole genome sequencing, but less sensitive DNA fingerprinting methods. Once we move to whole genome sequencing, we detect in the US between 7 and 10 outbreaks per year, up from 1 every 3 years. So it's about 30 times more outbreaks detected. Now, most likely, these are outbreaks that always occurred, but with these better tools, we are better at detecting them, which means they become more apparent to consumers, they become more apparent throughout the food chain, to regulators, etc., which has definitely driven up and enhanced the need and the perceived need by industry and others to address foodborne illnesses. So technology changes play an important role as we view foodborne illnesses throughout the world. In addition, these whole genome sequence data, this extremely powerful fingerprinting tools, have also driven a difference in how we share and how we make data accessible. Early on, with different DNA fingerprinting methods, these data were held by government agencies. Fingerprinting data now, whole genome sequence data now, are shared through public databases often, to a point where everyone can access more than 400,000 genome sequences for Salmonella, as I said, the major pathogen of concern. Publicly available to everyone, including in many cases location data. Which may leave up with the question is, we've struggled with trying to reduce foodborne illness and improve food safety for so long. We appear to have powerful techniques. How can it be so difficult and challenging to reduce foodborne illnesses? The challenge is that contamination can occur throughout the chain, as both Joel and Ralph mentioned. Anything from the environment to the water that is used to irrigate plants, for example, to retail, which means we need a systems approach. The sources and transmission patterns differ by pathogens. You saw that there was a long list, locations, seasons, etc. You can't use a one-size-fits-all process unless you take what I would call relatively extreme and blunt tools, such as irradiation, which even that cannot be used on all foods for various reasons. Many people think testing will work. It does not work. Contamination is often low-leveled and infrequent. Even a food where we may only have 1 package out of 100 contaminated is still a public health issue, as food is consumed so frequently. However, detecting food that is contaminated level at 1 out of 100 is very difficult. So food safety strategy need to be effective and cost effective. We need to produce food that is affordable with regard to food to assure food security. You combine all of this, and I would call food safety a wicked problem, a problem that is difficult or impossible to solve because incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements, problem that cannot be fixed. There's no single solution to this problem. And as Ralph mentioned, there's social complexity added to it, there are interdependencies, which is why we really need to change how we address food safety and how we could drive continued improvements in reducing food safety issues. And digital tools and digital approaches are one tool in the toolbox that we need to use more, that we will focus on today. Now, food spoilage is another key component to food security and to consumer perception of the foods that we produce, and a key consumer expectation. Consumers expect that the food does not spoil or shows limited spoil, that we minimize food waste and loss to minimize the environmental impact of food production. We've probably all seen and heard about the data with regard to food waste and food loss. And one important thing to consider is the FAO in their 2019 report differentiates between food loss and food waste in a way where food loss is what happens in the supply chain where we exclude retail, food service, and consumers. So this would be in farm and processing, while food waste is what occurs and what is due to decisions and actions by retailers, food service, and food consumers. So food loss early on, food waste is what happens after the food is produced. Many people use these terms interchangeably, maybe sometimes even flip how they're used, so you want to be careful. If you look at the scope here, this is just food loss, so only part of it. Mostly when we combine food loss and waste, the estimates are in about total 30 to 40% of food does not reach the consumer due to the combined effects of food loss and food waste. Here again, you see some differences by regions, but food loss anywhere from a low estimate of 5 for Australia and New Zealand to Central and Southern Asia, more than 20%. In the US, there were estimates that suggest 40% of the food is lost. When they say reported to go to waste, they mean really food loss and food waste. Here's some of more detailed data on this. Here we see the problems with nomenclature. So we talk about losses from the food supply, but we talk about retail level and consumer level. Now, that's not food loss by the FAO, but will be food waste by FAO. That alone, in many cases, is 30%. So substantial impact on the sustainability and environmental impact of food production. If that much food is lost after substantial amount of energy and natural resources are used to produce it. Now, technology also had an impact of how consumers perceive food loss and food waste. And the technology I'm talking here about is social media. This is an old example, but it's one that is illustrative and has repeated itself many times over since then. This is a US, obviously a Facebook post, but any social media could be used and is used for the same thing. In this case, a person posted a picture of a Capri Sun, which is essentially a sugary drink in a package that spoiled due to yeast contamination, which turned this sugary beverage into alcohol, which one person gave to her little son, and so the little son drank alcohol. He pointed out to his mother. Her mother's friend put it on Facebook, 400,000 shares, 30,000 likes. But this is not where it ended. Kraft Foods, the company that at that time produced Capri Sun, had to issue a recall, complete recall, clean out all retailers from Capri Sun, redesigned the packaging, restocked. My estimate is cost them hundreds of millions of dollars because of social media. So very different technologies, whole genome sequencing on one hand, social media on the other hand, impact how important and how easy it is, how we recognize the issues of food waste and loss and food spoilage and food safety. There's a wide range of strategy to reduce food loss and food waste. Overall, this is a very similar issue to food safety, and it also is one of these wicked problems because of the complexity of it. We can reduce, hopefully at farm level, processing and retail, consumer level, but most important, at the systems level. The different types of strategies in terms of where they implement and how they implement it differs slightly, but it maintains very challenging for individual firms, regions, etc., to decide the best and the most appropriate strategies. Okay. We have covered this in detail in a different symposium that we recently have, and as a follow-up to this, we will share the recordings for this symposium where we dug into a lot more details of this. So with these first two parts, I hopefully impressed on you the scope of the issue and the challenging nature of addressing food safety and reducing food spoilage. So what I'm going to pivot to now is how do we move in the future? How do we improve our ability to control food safety, reduce food safety issues, and reduce food spoilage and hence reduce food loss and food waste? And the concept I'm going to offer to you is the idea of precision food systems. Not a particular novel idea, but the idea here is that we can and will use the tools that are used in precision agriculture, GIS tools, global information systems, and personalized medicine, and combine them to improve our ability to reduce food loss and food waste, the environmental impacts of food processing and production, and improve food safety. This can range from an improved ability to predict and prevent food safety issues, using digital tools to model and predict when, where, and how these issues occur, and allow people to make better decisions how to reduce them. It also includes the use of improved prevention tools, such as these microbial fingerprinting methods that I mentioned to you. Ultimately, the hope is, and what we're going to talk about for the rest of the day today, is how can we use models and digital tools to build decision support tools that allow us to better assure food safety and reduce food spoilage, and apply them throughout the whole food chain. In the long and medium term, and it's an important concept, I think, for everyone to keep it, we will need to develop the digital infrastructure. And we have already started with this. I'm not starting from ground zero, but we still do have a long way to go to build a digital infrastructure for reducing food waste and food loss. Now, as we build this, one essential thing we need to keep in mind is that good models, these digital food systems, require data, lots of data. Data that often held in private hands right now, for example. So data sharing is essential, but there are many barriers to data sharing. Anything from misuse, legal liability, fear of reputational damage, etc. Including issues that some people think, some companies, firms might think there's money to be made, but there's no business model. Who pays for it? Does anyone pay for data sharing? All of these are additional issues that need to be resolved as we try to move to digital food systems and this idea of precision food systems. There are approaches that are increasingly being developed to allow for data sharing to address these issues. We need these tools that assure privacy and confidentiality. The recording that we will share of you of the other symposium, maybe put a little bit more detail in it, but take a look in the ideas of differential privacy models, federated learning. They come from completely different fields, but they have potentially tremendous applications to the digital future of food systems that we are exploring. Now, even with all these systems, we need to realize that we will never develop a perfect food system that will not have an associated risk of food safety incidents and spoilage risks. We can minimize these risks, but even a perfectly functioning system will remain to have a residual food safety risk. This is the risk that remains after, we can say, a fully compliant food safety system, or maybe even a societal optimal food safety system has been implemented. One way to think about this concept is even if you do everything right, you could still get hit by lightning. Even if everyone involved in the food system does everything right, people will still get foodborne illness. It will be infrequent, but it will occur. Just like you can get struck by lightning, even if you're inside your house and don't stand outside, as this story illustrates. The question then and the challenge then becomes, can we accept a certain level of risk? And this transitions us into some of the societal changes of controlling food safety and improving food safety. But we have models here too. If we build things like flood control dams, we decide that a certain risk is appropriate. It is, we accept a risk that every 100 years, a 100-year flood will flow over this dam that we develop, for example. How do we get there? We need to be able to measure the residual risk, because only have measures can we define acceptable risk. There are different measurements that we may use. If we can measure with regard to public health impact, what's the likelihood of what's the risk of a food causing death, even if we implement everything right, or the chance of the business risk, the enterprise impact, the chance of it causing a recall. WHO has built a roadmap for this and has shown us some of the tools. the common public health related measures we will use for residual risk, probably the easiest ones are what I mentioned before, disability adjusted life years or quality adjusted life years. These allow us to quantify the public health impact and the residual risk. And we can also measure residual risk with different denominators. Is it the risk per serving, which helps us assess the risk for an individual person? How likely am I going to get sick if I eat this food? Or the risk per million or another unit of population per year? This is more appropriate to assess public health policies and depends on consumption patterns. If food is rarely consumed and less safe, the risk on a per population basis is lower than a commonly consumed food that might be more safe. And this is what illustrates this. If you look at two different types of milk, pasteurized milk and unpasteurized milk carries a higher risk. If I drink the milk, I'm more likely to get sick. But in terms of the overall population of a country such as the US, because pasteurized milk is much more consumed, the public health impact is much higher of this. In addition, there are business-related measures. Enterprise risk. Could be the risk of a recall, could be other measures of the enterprise impact of food safety. So these quantitative methods to evaluate risks are very important as we build these future digital and more sophisticated food systems. Once we have these measures, how do we decide on the acceptable risk? Another challenge in the future. This is a challenge for risk managers. In many countries, public health policy may have set us goals. How many foodborne illness due to salmonella do we want in the year 2030? This is what this number represents. Okay. In some places, the European Union, they have decided a certain level of risk is very low. Okay. Minimal risk is risk of 1 fatality per million people. May not sound small to some of us, particularly in a country with a high population, but these are different approaches. I'm not endorsing one over the other. I'm simply stating what they are. If you want to learn more about this, here's a paper that we published on residual risk. Part of the bigger picture in terms of how we develop these future precision food systems that allow us to make better decisions how to reduce food safety and food waste. So with this, hopefully I've convinced you that a food systems approach to food safety and reducing food loss and waste is essential, even though it's still often missing. I think we have to be honest there. But many of the tools needed to improve food safety and reduce food waste are available. We now need to implementation of these tools and need to build the infrastructure. So I do think it is time to think about a digital food infrastructure to really help us to take this next step in terms of developing more secure food systems throughout the world. We will need to consider trade-offs. Not every strategy that we can use to reduce food waste will have a net positive with regard to sustainability or environmental impact. And finally, I left you with the idea of residual risk, how to consider it, how to quantify it. Because even with all of this, even with this, the best system will not be risk-free. So with this, I hope I've given you sort of an overview of the challenges, the opportunities, and an introduction of why we're talking about model and digital systems for the rest of today's symposium. With that, I want to thank the financial support we received. First and foremost, the Walmart Foundation. It really helped us to take this to the next level. But then a number of other groups that helped us to also do work in this space. With that, I'll turn it back to Lynn.
Great, Martin. We have a couple of questions for you, actually, from Chandra Prasad. So the first is, what is an acceptable food waste percentage? What are we aiming for?
I don't think I've not seen any goals. So we have set goals for foodborne illnesses. Some countries have and many have not. I've not yet seen any clear goals for that. I think at this point, we're really still in a stage where we're trying to even really try to get accurate measures. If you look at, some of the measures I gave of foodborne illnesses, often they included credible intervals to say, hey, we think it's 1 million cases of salmonella, and we're pretty sure we're 95% sure it's between 800,000 and 1.2 million. On the food waste, we are still at the infancy. We say 30%. What does 30% mean? It doesn't mean 30%. Does it mean between 25 and 35? Or between 15 and 45? So in food waste, to a certain extent, we are behind with regard to some of these metrics, and I've not seen any clear quantifiable goals. It also depends on, reducing food waste is what impact? Is it just a percentage, or is it reducing the impact based on, let's say, greenhouse gas emission or other metrics? So there's some work to be done there. Very good question, but I've not seen anyone be there yet to give us specific goals.
Okay, and another question.
Mm-hmm.
We are also building a digital platform that can be used to monitor food safety, but foresee issues that companies don't want to use it due to unwillingness to risk their info. How do we get companies to be more willing to use these types of digital systems?
Yeah, I think that's sort of what we're getting at, the idea of just data sharing and how we can help people make sure data sharing is more secure. They feel there's less risk. I think sometimes people are not even just worried about the data sharing, even they're worried about if a model is built with their data, someone could essentially reconstruct who provided the data, and it could have negative impact. I think it's a long way in some places to really get people's confidence. Some of it will have to do probably with a regulatory framework. It's not just, it can't just be volunteer. I think at some point there is a role for governments to step in and saying, this is how we minimize the risk of abuse and creates what some people call safe harbors, safe places where it's okay to share those data and use these data. It is a global conversation. I don't think that's a simple single solution. It has to be a combination of new digital technologies, but also regulations and regulatory frameworks.
Great, thank you for your questions. If there are no more questions for Martin, we can move on to session 2. But if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A or even into chat. Okay, we can move on to our second session, which will be with Professor Renata Ivanek, who will be talking to us about microbial modeling.
Thank you, Lynn. All right. Just unmute myself here. Well, pleased to be here. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to talk about, I'll give an introduction to microbial modeling, starting from very basic to more advanced level, and let's get going. So I will introduce the concept of models and what models could and should be used. I will spend a few minutes talking about predictive microbiology as one aspect of models, one way models could be used, and then I will talk about more on optimization and simulation models. And I'll finish with a few take-home messages. So what is a model? Very broadly, model is a simplified representation of a system. And a system is a process of interest. And so if you think about today's topic in this webinar, food quality, food safety, then our process of interest could, for example, be spoilage of a package of lettuce, or it could be contamination with foodborne pathogens of deli meat serving, or it could be at a whole lot level, contamination or risk of foodborne disease from a lot of frozen foods, or it could be even in an environment, contamination with the microorganisms of interest, or even pathogens in the food processing facility. So then the next question, is how can we study a system? The simplest and typically, not the simplest, the best approach typically is to experiment with the actual system. But here we have a problem. For example, if we want to experiment with foods, once you experiment with it, obviously you can no longer eat it. So there are obstacles in actually using this approach. Another example where this would not be possible, for example, if our system of interest is foodborne disease in humans, then it will be unethical to expose people just to experiment with them. So that leaves that option typically is not available for us to study a system. So the next best approach is to use some model of a system. So here is our first introduction to the concept of model. But model can be both physical and mathematical. And so I first want to explain use of a physical model. For example, we can experiment with lettuce samples that are representative of some lettuce consumed in US or in China, in order, for example, to determine shelf life. And this is done a lot. We use model systems, physical model systems, to a great extent. The limitation is that we would love to be able to extrapolate and generalize to other situations, and even to generate data and systems, so we do not have to experiment with physical systems. Again, because experimenting with physical systems is costly, both in time and resources. So that leads us to the different, more theoretical aspects of a model, the mathematical models that is actually the core of my talk today. So mathematical model is a system, just very broadly, a system of logical and quantitative relationships that we manipulate and change to see how the model reacts. So in some way, it's like an experiment with a physical experiment with this physical system, but using equations and quantitative relationships. Now, there are many different types of models, and there can be grouped in many different ways. And I've chosen for this presentation to group them in kind of two big buckets. One group is use of models to describe a system, or systems that are simple enough to create to provide analytical solution. Analytical solution meaning that once you have an equation and you have ingredients, you can make a simple prediction very quickly. For example, if you know the speed and how far you need to go, you can predict at what time you will get there. So a big group of models in this big bucket that I want to mention are models used in predictive microbiology. And there are many of them. They are actually even grouped into three further buckets. One simply called primary models, which are used to describe microbial processes like growth or an activation or survival of microorganisms as a function of time. And the goal of primary models is to estimate parameters for those microbial processes. For example, to be able to find the rate of growth or rate of inactivation, so that we could then apply them in a different system or in the same system, but without the need of the actual experiment. Some models used here are exponential model, logistic model without a lag. For those who have used them, they will sound familiar. Then slightly different and more advanced models are called secondary models. They describe parameters of microbial processes, growth, inactivation, survival, as a function of some other factor. For example, we might be interested in the rate of growth as a function of temperature, temperature higher, temperature lower, or equally the rate of inactivation as a function of temperature. Again, there are many models in this group. And then tertiary models integrate primary and secondary models in different ways. And probably many in this audience have heard of Combase as an example of a tertiary model. So another big bucket that I want to talk about, that I will actually talk much more today, is on simulation optimization models. So what is a simulation? It means using a computer to imitate or simulate operation of various operations of various kinds of real-world systems. So in other words, to imitate some real phenomena. And in a simulation, we numerically exercise the model, mathematical model, for the inputs in question to see how they will affect the output of interest in the same model in order to measure performance, to try to understand the cause and effect relationship. Or we know the cause and effect relationship, and then we included our understanding of it, we embed in the model. These simulation models typically are used to describe complex systems and when analytical solution is not possible. Oftentimes, simulation models and optimization models use predictive microbiology models or their parameters as basic building blocks. So the two big buckets that I delineated, those that have analytic solution and describe in simulation optimization, there is actually a lot of overlap. So in simulation optimization models, there are again many different kinds of models, and today I just want to talk about three groups: risk assessment, spoilage, shelf life models, and agent-based models, as some of the models that we have used extensively in our research. But before going there, I want to take us back a little bit and maybe just reiterate why using models and for what. So models are helping us solve real-world problems, whether it's predicting how many foodborne cases we are going to see, or how what should be the best buy or use by date on a package of food. And they help us in many different ways. And here is the list. In some ways, models can help us. They help us define the problem more accurately. They help us organize what we know. They help us understand the data that we have available, or even more importantly, often what we do not know, where data do not exist and where more data needs to be collected. We can test knowledge with models. They are very cheap in a way. They are very cheap experimental platforms to do so. They can also help us understand what are the driving factors that generate some patterns or phenomena. Many, many times in food quality and food safety, mathematical models are used for prediction. That is actually one of the things that our research has focused on. And then overall, mathematical models are essential for decision support or support decision making, and they are going to be the essence of digital technology that Martin was talking about. And so in the process of model building, the process may look something like this. So we will start with the real world problem, whatever the question we want to analyze. We will try to describe that problem in mathematical forms, whether rules or equations. We will obtain parameters from the literature. Then with the model that was built, we will do analysis and we will arrive to a mathematical conclusion. But that's a mathematical conclusion. It needs to be translated into a biological conclusion. In other words, it has to be interpreted. We typically then compare biological conclusion or interpretation with available data in the process that we call validation. And then if that doesn't match what we expected or what the existing data show, we might have to go back into this loop, redefine the model until we get it right, or until we learn from the model. So the process can actually take quite a bit of time. And when I said that mathematical models are very cheap platform for experimentation, that is correct when the model is developed, but it may take a really long time to develop a model after many, many loops of this kind. So here is a first example of a model that I want to introduce. And it was a model that was developed for shelf life of milk, optimization of shelf life. So it was an optimization model, and the goal was to identify where should a dairy processor invest to reduce milk waste due to spoilage. What should a dairy processor do to extend shelf life of milk in order to reduce waste? The model itself is much, much more complex and many pages long than this little snippet that I'm showing here. And the approach used is called mixed integer linear programming. This is not actually a simulation approach, but there are in optimization research stochastic models that involve simulation. Then in most models, we'll have a component or work that needs to be done on model parameterization. And then finally, we come to the optimal solution. In this case, it was a combination of different interventions that a dairy processor could pick in order to extend shelf life for milk in the cheapest possible way. This study was recently published in Frontiers for Sustainable Food Systems, and I would be happy to provide links afterwards. I want to also introduce a study that we are working on now that is somewhat similar to the study just described. It's also a shelf life optimization problem, but this time the goal is to optimize organic spinach supply chain in China. And it is actually work funded by Walmart Foundation with our partners in China. So the goal of this project is to identify the most optimal shelf life of spinach to match spinach production and demand size. And then in addition to shelf life that is affected by factors like washing, temperature control, the other decision controls are packing, what kind of packing is used, whether there are certification, pricing, and so on. And so little by little, this can grow into a big problem. Like in any other models, that will have to be some kind of a model structure that may look like a supply chain or decision variables that are affecting one of the outcomes or the objective function. And again, model parameters. With this, I want to switch gears and talk about risk assessment, which is another big group of models that are being used. But before that, I want to just touch on the definitions because it may be relevant to understanding the topic. So risk assessment is related to risk analysis, and you will shortly see how. Risk analysis involves examination of some unwanted outcome or some kind of risk. And so that brings us to the concept of risk, which is defined as the probability of occurrence of some hazard and magnitude of consequences of that hazard occurring. And that brings us to the concept of hazard, which is a condition or physical situation with potential for undesirable consequence or harm. And I wanted to talk about this because oftentimes the terms hazard and risk are used interchangeably, but in risk assessment and risk analysis world, they have very, very clear definitions. So hazard is again presence of some condition or situation that has the potential to cause harm, while a risk is the actual probability of harm happening and the magnitude of it. So for example, having water nearby can be hazard, but jumping in water without knowing how to swim would be a risk. Being nearby gasoline is a hazard, but lighting a match near gasoline, that's a risk. Driving in itself can be very pleasurable, but it is also a hazard, and it's hazard if we also text. So I mentioned that I will also come to explaining the relationship with risk assessment and risk analysis. So risk assessment is part of the whole discipline that's called risk analysis. So risk assessment is the second component of that whole framework that starts with hazard identification or identifying processes that may be causing harm, that may present harm. Having contamination in a food is a hazard, but exposure to contaminated foods would then lead to a risk. Risk assessment involves quantification of hazard and the magnitude of risk occurring. But then there are two more components. One is risk management, that once the risk is assessed and quantified, then decision is made how we are going to manage it. What are the strategies we are going to use in order to reduce the risk? And then finally, how we are going to communicate it. Because sometimes messaging, if not done right, can actually do more harm, where somebody may be warned about, for example, mercury in fish and reduce fish consumption, while at the same time losing nutrients from fish that would be actually beneficial. So risk communication is a very important component to risk analysis. But the risk assessment is the scientific part that is based on quantification and modeling, which is the topic of today's discussion. So here's an example of a risk assessment and the steps. So we will start with a hazard, identification of the hazard or understanding that there is a hazard, and then posing a risk question. A hazard in this study was Listeria monocytogenes in frozen, non-ready-to-eat foods, like frozen vegetables. And the risk question was, what is the risk of listeriosis from a lot of frozen, non-ready-to-eat foods to consumers? There was a quite complex and detailed risk pathway developed, model parameters identified, and then assessed risk. And then here is just a representation and explanation of that risk. The study was published in Journal of Food Production a few years ago, and again, I would be happy to share it. I want to, before moving on to yet another modeling method, I want to mention something that I personally find very useful, and especially in assessing the risk. So it's a concept that was introduced many years ago, now more than 15 years ago. It's called modular process risk model. And I find it very useful because it provides a really nice logical structure how to go about quantifying risk, or how to go about quantifying risk progression through a pathway, for example, farm to chain pathway, in order to quantify risk of human exposure. So modular process risk model is a method that makes that helps quantitative exposure assessment. And the way it's done, it follows food product as it moves through different processing stages, and can go all the way from farm all the way to consumer, or it can focus on a specific, a smaller segment of that production chain. And in each stage, two aspects, the model is used to quantify two aspects: prevalence or probability that a food component or food piece or a unit of food, whether it's a bunch of spinach or it's a fish or is it a carton of milk, whether it's contaminated, yes, no. And then second question, with how many bacteria. And then the whole process is divided into steps or modules, where each module will have only one basic process assigned to it. And those basic processes are growth, inactivation, mixing, partitioning, removal, and cross-contamination. And this is maybe the reason why I like this approach so much, because it allows us to, in a very structured way, keep track of both prevalence of contaminated food units, number of bacteria in contaminated food units, and also keeping track of the food unit size, whether it's increasing or decreasing. So let's see an example. If microorganisms are growing in a unit of food, let's say this is a milk package. In that package, and they're only growing individual packages, prevalence of contaminated packages does not increase, but the number of bacteria does. And product size, package does not increase. It is the opposite for inactivation, maybe with pasteurization, for example, the microorganisms are being removed or killed. Mixing involves bringing together different food units. Maybe we are mixing different leafy greens into a package of salad for package that will be then sold in store. And so that process can increase prevalence, will not by itself change bacterial number, but it will also increase product size. Partitioning is the opposite. For example, if we want to slice a melon, we will maybe slice melon and create several servings. And removal involves removing certain parts of the package, or certain parts of the product, and throwing it away. And then cross-contamination is the most complex of these processes that can increase prevalence, can increase bacterial counts, but would not change product size. Here's an example of a study where we use this modular process risk model. This was a study of Listeria monocytogenes in smoked salmon fillets. So we follow unit of food with whole food to fillet, and in each module we assign different basic process: cross-contamination, mixing, inactivation, removal, and so on. This study is now quite outdated, but as I said, the modular process risk assessment I found very useful even today in different kinds of model structuring, because it provides that useful, very intuitive structure to follow. Now that brings me to the third type of model I want to briefly discuss. They are called agent-based models. These are computational models. They are rule-based, and they are known to people under different names: agent-based model, agent-based simulation, agent-based, individual-based models. So here's an example of what agent-based model components that an agent-based model will have. So it will have agents, which may be equipment or even pieces of equipment, and employees. Each employee would be an agent. These agents are in a specific environment, simulated environment. For example, this may be a food processing facility with simulated walls, floor, ceiling, and so on, and time step. And so agents are discrete, they are different from each other, and they act independently from each other and interact with each other and the environment, and this allows contamination to spread. The first of this kind of models that was published in our group was published 2 years ago. It was called Enable. It was published in Scientific Reports, and since then we have published 2 more papers with 4 additional models using the same approach. And here's how it works. So we started a problem, and this problem may be contamination of this facility with microorganisms of interest. So we have 2 people, and we have some conveyor belt and cutting tables and so on. So this is our real world, which we then translate into a model. And we translate it with a great level of detail. We model every little square of floor, walls, and ceilings. And then with those dots, we identify agents of interest, which are pieces of equipment, and we also include people as agents. Now, when contamination is introduced into this system, we will be able to follow it, where it's more likely to go, depending on connections that individuals make with each other or equipment makes with each other. We can even test different intervention strategies, from cleaning, deep clean sanitation, even removal of equipment and replacement. And then we proceed to simulation. And in simulation, we may, for example, ask, what's the risk of contamination in a specific area, or of even contamination of food? Or we can ask, if we make a certain change in the facility, how would that affect the risk? And that helps us make decisions. So many of the models used that I'm describing use Monte Carlo simulation, which is a computerized mathematical technique that allows us to account for uncertainty and variability in quantitative analysis and decision making. So, but what is variability? What's uncertainty? Variability is the heterogeneous or nature around us, acknowledging that things are different. Different packages of milk may have different quantity of bacteria in them. Uncertainty, on the other hand, is lack of knowledge regarding the true value. So it's how little we know about the quantity of interest. So in Monte Carlo simulation, we substitute a parameter value with a probability distribution and then sample from it. It's almost like throwing a dice. And then every time we do that, the outcome is affected in a different way. And then we quantify relationship between the input from the probability distribution and the outcome, which is then also probability distribution. So in a typical analysis of simulation models, we will spend a lot of time on model validation that can involve different techniques. And then the one that is most commonly used is predictive validation. We will arrive to a prediction, which again, because we are using simulation, as I said earlier, because we are using simulation and we are sampling from distributions of input parameters, the outcome will also be a distribution. We will do sensitivity analysis where we want to know how change in individual parameters, one or together, multiple together, affect the outcome of interest. Or we may run different what-if scenario analysis. So it's important to again keep in mind that inherent in the outcome or prediction of a simulation model is that there is variability in and uncertainty in the model inputs, and therefore prediction is also a probability distribution. And another point that I want to make is that these models, as helpful they do have limitations, and they are due to a level of details in the model that sometimes reality is far more complex that we can include in the model. So simplification presents a limitation. And another limitation is due to uncertainty where we do not have enough knowledge to represent something in a system. So a typical format of an outcome could be a distribution that will have where we are interested in the median or the mean, and then we may want to know the 5th and 95th percentile of this distribution, or in other words, where the range of values where 90% of predictions lie. So the most valuable benefit from a simulation model is actually to gain insight, not necessarily to find absolute answer. The answer is in the distribution. And to make a further point, simulation models are decision support tools. They are not crystal balls. They are decision support tools. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up with a few take-home messages. Again, model is a simplified representation of the real world. For example, a contamination of a food package. Mathematical models describe real world with equations and rules. Agent-based models and risk assessments that I spend most time discussing are two types of simulation models. And predictive microbiology is often used to support simulation models. So like an integral building block. Simulation models use probability distributions as values of model inputs. And predictions from simulation models are therefore probability distribution itself. Because of that, they will represent the inherent uncertainty and variability of the model. In other words, variability in the system, but also uncertainty or our poor understanding of the problem. Another important point, it is important to validate the model before it's used for prediction. And the key point I want to leave you with is that model predictions should support decision-making and not be taken literally. With that, again, thanking the various funders that have supported this work, and many of the studies that I presented are produced by members of my lab. With that, and thanking Walmart Foundation, thank you so much. I will be happy to answer any questions.
So to start us off, Renata, I see one question in the Q&A. So the question is it possible to build a model that is customized to a food processor? What foreseeable challenges are involved?
Yes, it is. And in fact, thank you. That's a great question. It is possible. In fact, that's the whole premise of the group of models that we have developed enable, where we take into account the blueprints, the actual spatial relationships, even dimensions in a facility, and processes they do. What is the schedule of those processes in the production? So it is done. It is very, very time consuming and very labor intensive, at least now. Maybe newer digital technologies that are able to scan the environment and translate into a digital, in the virtual environment would help this in the future. So it is already happening. And I think the value that the industry sees is that it's the model of their own facility. It's like a digital twin of their facility. It's an avatar they could use to ask different questions and understand the processes that are happening. I hope that answers the question.
I don't see any other questions or hands raised. So if you think of questions to all the attendees, if you think of questions a little later, we can also take them at the end of all the sessions. We're running a little bit ahead of schedule, so there will be time for additional Q&A. At this point, we can move on to our third session, which is entitled Examples of Food Spoilage and Food Safety Models. I'm really happy to introduce a professor from the University of Shanghai for Science and Technology, who is joining us tonight to talk about his work on microbial modeling as one of the examples of food spoilage and food safety models. Professor Qingli Dong.
Yes, I can hear. Wait a moment, I will share my screen. Okay, good morning and good evening to everyone. This is Qingli Dong from University of Shanghai for Science Technology. So many thanks to Lin's great help to make this online workshop smooth. And I'm now locked at Shanghai home due to this pandemic. And you know, this is a risk world. Today, I will give a short description about our group's progress of list monocytogenes on risk modeling. Today, I will give some contents, including list monocytogenes prevalence, some predictive models establishment, and some primary research on risk assessment and management. Finally, is conclusion and remarks. So first about list monocytogenes prevalence. Just now, Martins gave a good description about foodborne disease burden internationally, and he gave FBD about Salmonella and Campylobacter. Here is the list monocytogenes. You can see from this map reported by WHO about disability adjusted life years per 100,000 people for listed races. And you can see from different color, and Africa and South America is darker than other places. So this is statistical data. Next, about some factors affecting the survival and transmission of list monocytogenes in the environment and food chain. From this picture, you can see from the soil microbiota and like some weather, human contamination. Finally, this strain will go to our table. From some specific food, like ready-to-eat food, consumer can get contaminated by this strain. Next, another simplified scheme of transmission route of list monocytogenes. from different environment to the food industry. So you can see it's very serious and strain we should put more attention. Next picture is from Food Agriculture Organization in 2020. So X is incidence per 100,000 people, and Y is daily. So you can see Lister monocytol genus is here. It has a maybe not very high incidence, but it has high death cost. Okay, so next picture is to show some foodborne incidence per 100,000 and daily for the 14 microhazard selected, and this strain is higher than other hazard. So next, we also have conducted some research based on systematic review and meta-analysis. We use this method to describe the prevalence of Lister monocytol genus in specific products in mainland China. From this China map, you can see the above is some raw food, raw meat, and the bottom is some cooked meat. The dark color means they have high prevalence, like Northeast and Southwest have high prevalence, and raw food is higher than cooked food. Actually, from another report in China, the prevalence of Lister monocytol genus is about 4% for 28 prevalence of whole country. Due to some meat products or animal products, it increased to 8%. So meta-analysis is a very useful method. Actually, we have used this method to focus on some other pathogens like Salmonella, E. coli. Also, with some help of Shanghai CDC, we conduct sampling and detection of Lister monocytol genus in 2017 and 18, and we detect Lister monocytol genus in several cooked meat in Shanghai. So totally is 374 samples. We can see from this picture, some markets and supermarkets have high prevalence. Because we use some qualitative method to detect this strain, so next we use some statistical transformation, try to turn qualitative state to quantitative data. We use the dataset A and B, and this method is called zero inflated Poisson log normal distribution. So this table is to show the parameter estimate from this method. Next, we use this method. We try to correlate the two sets of data and to describe prevalence of Lister monocytol genus in Shanghai. So this is the dataset A. Next is dataset B. So this picture is to show cumulative mass transmission of this strain in Shanghai. Also, last year, with the help of Shanghai CDC, we combined 10 years molecular surveillance of Lister monocytol genus using whole gene sequence WGS in Shanghai from 2009 to 2019. From these two tables, we can see different cell types of Lister monocytol genus like 2A and 2B. These two cell groups was identified among most of food groups, in Shanghai. And prevalence of cell groups, the 2B, was significantly higher in some ready-to-eat foods and raw materials. Also, from CC type, we can see CC9 in raw meat and raw poultry in Shanghai, and CC9 in raw poultry and CCH7 in raw seafood significantly exceeded that of in other food groups. I think this result is quite different from other countries' statistics like some European countries and USA. We also use some PFGE method to focus on least monocytogeneous contamination characterization in 2 ready-to-eat meat plants, also in Shanghai, and we can see that ST5 for this strain isolated have persisted for a long time in the ready-to-eat meat processing plant. So now we will conduct further research on ST5, and maybe ST5 is a specific strain in Shanghai or in China, and we will conduct further research. Next, about some predictive models to list monocytogenesis from our research group. I think just now, Renata gave a good description about predictive microbiology and its application in quantitative micro risk assessment. In our group, we have conducted some predictive models, including computation modeling, single cell modeling, cross-contamination modeling, and some software development. First, about computation models. Due to the least monocytogenesis, we used this strain in some raw pork inoculated by some acid bacteria with modified atmosphere package. Because 2 strains under this environment will survive, so we use some predictive models like modified logistic models to describe these 2 strains. From the result, we can see that with time goes on, the 2 different strains will grow differently, with the CO2 increase and least monocytogenesis could be affected very significantly. For the detail, we can see with CO2 increase, the Nmax of least monocytogenesis will decrease and mu-max will decrease. Lag phase will increase, and finally we can get this parameter we call gamma parameter to show that different LAB affect least monocytogenesis in meat samples. Next, we have conducted some research about single cells of least monocytogenesis. This is some mathematical theory how to describe the numbers of strain. We know that different history condition will affect the strain growth. So we used different pre-cultural temperature. So here we used 0 degrees centigrade and other temperatures. We can see that from 18 single cells of least monocytogenesis, it has very different growth phenomena. And from this table, we can see the history temperature 0, 5, 10, and 15. When his temperature equals to 15, there is some zero lag rates about 18%. And we also use some probability distribution like Weber to describe these different growths. And the next picture is to show some cumulative distribution fitted to least monocytogenesis single cell lag times. From the right picture, you can see that different pre-cultural temperature will have different lag phase Next, we studied some cross-contamination due to Listeria monocytogenes. During some chopping process of pork, we try to use some different tries to describe our different condition. So we can use the M1 to M4 to show different yeast addition for different times, and also use some procession condition like wiped with dry rag or other procession condition. Totally is about 16 scenarios. We use modified models to describe this process and try to get a better goodness of fit for these established models. Next, the tables, we can see that different procession will get different result, and untreated procession will significantly higher than other conditions. So trying to, based on this cross-contamination, we can use this result combined into risk assessment. Also, next, we have conducted some research about Listeria monocytogenes under different treatments. Here is about H. lactic acid, basilism, chloride, and niacin. So with this various mild bacteria treatment, we can see that Listeria monocytogenes is growth parameter lag phase will be different. And also we models different acid adaptation for Listeria monocytogenes. Here we used 33 strains of Listeria monocytogenes. We can see different strains. Here we use different serotypes, so it has different growth conditions. Also, our new research, we try to model different nutritional stress. Here you can see that relative adhesion at different times, 3 hours or 24 hours, is a biofilm growth will quite different. Also have a high correlation. We used the EPS and SEM analysis to describe this difference and try to describe differences of gene expression for Listeria monocytogenes. Next, we have built a free software. It's called MicroRisk Lab. So it's an online modeling firmware for predict microbiology. Based on this, we can input some data, use different predictive models, including 36 different models, and also can turn this deterministic state to probability state to give different risk assessment. We also, with the help of China Food Safety Risk Assessment Center, we built a national platform in China. We focus on Listeria monocytogenes, Salmonella, and Vibrio, these 3 strains. We use the national monitoring data set and also can conduct some simulation for growth, survival, and dose response. Finally, can give a quick micro risk assessment result. So this platform is under construction. Next, we have conducted some primary study for risk assessment, also risk management for Listeria monocytogenes. Because some meat supply chain is quite long, so from the beginning, like livestock and poultry, finally to consumers, we try to use some parameter settings to simulate its different condition. It shows here. So left is effective temperature, and the right is effect of type and humidity for list monocytogenes. We use some data from literature or papers. Also, based on our previous study, we combined all the data into these tables. We used a predictive model to describe list monocytogenes growth and survival. We also use exponential models for those response relations of list monocytogenes. Then we used Bayes inference into this system. The result was shown here. So based on primary distribution, as shown in these black lines, and we get a posterior list monocytogenes concentration based on the date setting as shown before, and we can get some food poison probability, especially for children, young people, and elderly people. So we used the threshold value is 2 log CFU each gram for list monocytogenes. So based on this method, we can get the risk assessment result along the food chain. Also, for this modeling process, we try to optimize or improve our growth or survival models, especially under some dynamic conditions. So some technique details you can check several papers we have published. So finally, it's a conclusion. I think list monocytogenes is the highest in some meat products in China, and we can use meta-analysis for further studies. So different predictive models can be studies for list monocytogenes, like competitive models, some single cell models, cross-contamination, and also can build some software or tools. It is very easy to use. And based on predictive models, we can conduct risk assessment. Also can use some theory as Renata just showing, module process risk assessment. We can also use Bayes approach to demonstrate its ability to provide significant benefits for micro risk assessment. So finally, hosted by me. So it's called a micro risk workshop in China from 2014. So maybe post-pandemic, welcome you all to join in our new coming micro risk workshop in China. Also about list monocytogenes, with the help of Martin, so joined FAO and WHO for risk assessment. So this report will be opened soon. Finally, I will thank my research groups, Doctors Wang Xiang, Li Zhuosi, Ma Yue, Xia Xuejian, Liu Yangtai, Qin Xiaojie, Yang Shuo, and Mohammed Zohab. So that's all. Thank you very much. Finally, its word is called "You are what you risk." So we try to, based on our risk assessment, we can make a good decision. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zhang. Martin?
Okay, so I'm going to bring us home with a few more examples, which I hope with the really exciting and comprehensive examples on Listeria risk assessments we just heard, will give you an idea of the world that lies ahead of us with regard to applying different types of models to rebuild and develop more sustainable and safer food systems. So as Renata has shown, and as I mentioned before, is these models will allow us to develop digital decision support tools that will improve our decision making with regard to strategies to use to improve food safety and reduce food waste. And we've seen this with those listeria examples where these models can be used to, for example, decide which interventions, niacin versus other types of growth inhibitors, are better at reducing listeria-related food safety issues. What I'm going to focus on is how we can apply these tools to also reduce food spoilage and therefore food waste and food loss. And I'm going to illustrate this as an example of using pasteurized fluid milk products, or fresh milk as it is typically called in China. And partially as we use this model because we had a substantial amount of data collected over a long time to help us with validation of these models and building these models. So we developed Monte Carlo simulations to predict the shelf life due to spoilage by cyclotolerant spore formers, and then use these models to help companies make decisions in terms of which control strategies to use. So the base model we developed here use different input data to help us predict what a large number of fluid milk that's produced in a certain size container, so half gallon or could be a liter container, what patterns they show at certain days of shelf life. Now, important to consider here, the shelf life of fresh milk or high temperature short time milk produced in the US tends to be somewhat longer than this product often is in other countries, including in China. So when we use these models to predict shelf life of fluid milk stored at 6 degrees centigrade, we could see that on day 21 of shelf life, 25% of these containers of milk had extremely low bacterial counts on the baseline model. Now, this model can then predict these bacterial counts for different days in shelf life, whether it's day 24 or earlier days of shelf life. We can also use these models to then develop and show videos that sort of really follow the predicted shelf life over time. So what you see here is predicted shelf life from day 14 to day 24. And this histogram is the bacterial counts over time. So what you see that over shelf life, more and more, a larger and larger proportion of containers gets larger and larger bacterial counts. You see one peak of large bacterial counts on this side, which is a specific strain of spoilage organisms that grows to this higher level, but does not grow much higher. And this is what we would call a baseline model. As Renata mentioned in her presentation, it is important to validate these models against actual data. In this case, we had retrospective data from New York facilities, so from more than 20 years of monitoring these facilities, where we could see that our predicted shelf life very closely matched the shelf life that we observed in these commercially produced samples. Once you have a baseline model, is then when you really can utilize it as a decision support tool. So what we did in this, for example, is we started out with a very simple type of intervention or control strategies, where we had our baseline scenario and then modeled our what if scenario, where we said, what happens if we reduce temperature? The milk is stored from 6 degrees to 4 degrees centigrade. And you can see that this what seemingly small change in temperature, 2 degrees centigrade, reduces the number of half gallon or increases the number of half gallons with low bacterial counts, less than 20,000 per mil, from 34% to 91%. So much larger proportion of gallons is unlikely to spoil and be perceived with sensory defects by customers at later on in shelf life. Now, this is not necessarily a very practical intervention for many food products, particularly as we think about the future of e-commerce, as it is very difficult to assure storage temperatures throughout distribution, including in customer refrigerators. So we can then look at even with this, we can illustrate these types of interventions again with the same type of movies, where you can see the original spoilage and then the spoilage if we reduce the temperature. Now, where this gets more interesting for practical decision making for firms is when we then run what-if scenarios with these models. Say, what happens to the shelf life of fluid milk if we implement a technological solution such as microfiltration or other bacterial elimination or reduction strategies? These are important simulations for firms because implementing these technologies in a facility is a substantial investment of money and capital. So this one shows what happens if you have the original milk in gray, so our baseline scenario, and what happens to these bacterial counts if we implement microfiltration. And what we can see here through this model is, you can see this sort of at the different peaks, is that we extend the fluid milk shelf life by about 4 days by implementing this type of intervention. So that does not necessarily mean that we guarantee 4 days of shelf life, but it helps a company assess what is likely or feasible when we implement a specific intervention. We can then, because we have models, build a number of predictions in terms of the mean bacterial counts at a certain time in shelf life, day 21, the fraction of containers that have high levels, so 66% on a baseline, only 13% with microfiltration. We could even model microfiltrations or different bacterial reduction strategies with bacterial efficiencies, etc. So a wide range of interventions that can be modeled, hopefully illustrating to you how these models can be used as decision support tools. Now, these models could be developed generically to the best of our knowledge to predict what may happen on fluid milk shelf life for all milk produced in a certain country or region, assuming averages and distributions for key criteria such as bacterial count level, or these models could be developed for a specific firm or a specific supply chain. Once we have these models, these can then serve as sort of the underlying drivers for more sophisticated analysis, such as the analysis that Renata described in her work with Ferru on optimizing pasteurized fluid milk shelf life. These models, however, will even have further potential uses as we try to reduce food loss and food waste. And I'm going to illustrate in this example of what we call dynamic shelf life labeling. So if you look at many food products currently, they typically will have use by or best by or sell by dates on them. Now, these use by, particularly use by dates and the confusion along date labels has been linked to a substantial amount of food waste because consumers often might discard a carton of fluid milk or a product because it is past the date stamped on the carton. However, these dates are often designed and determined based on worst case scenarios, such as we put a date on that it makes sure or tries to assure that the product is of high quality, even if the consumer stores the milk at 7 or 8 degrees centigrade, when it should really be stored at 4 to 5 degrees centigrade. In the future, one could use the models we have along with some indication of temperatures, such as simplistic time temperature indicators, such as this fresh code indicator, to individually predict the shelf life of each carton of fluid milk. Not only does this provide the opportunity for improved shelf life prediction, but these tools could then be integrated with inventory status to determine the price of milk in a way where consumers, if they purchase milk that has a shorter shelf life remaining, pay less than consumers of byproducts that has a longer shelf life remaining. The details of shelf life prediction can and will be further refined by not only taking temperature data in account, but also potentially driving in or pulling in data on the raw milk that was used on each day, moving us towards more of a true digital twin that uses real-time data to individually predict shelf life of individual packages. So the basic concepts here of Monte Carlo simulations that Renata mentioned are applied here, similar to how they're applied in food safety risk assessments. Now, this work is also currently being expanded to work on fresh produce. This is the work funded by the Walmart Foundation. Very similar idea. We built these baseline Monte Carlo simulations. We assess different interventions that reduce contamination, extend shelf life to, number one, ultimately help companies such as Chimay and others to make better decisions and more informed decisions in terms of what technologies to use, but also move us towards the idea of dynamic shelf life labeling that then will help consumers make better decisions in terms of what product they have, how long they can store it, but also potentially drive dynamic pricing that would help retailers to move product more quickly, particularly if it's towards the end of shelf life. There is a social component to it. It's very important to recognize. That's why we're working on consumer choice evaluations with Lynn and Ralph on this and others in his department to really also understand how consumers will accept or will not accept these types of labelings. Interestingly enough, we actually currently have a trial at Cornell where we exploring and using these dynamic shelf life labels in milk that is being sold to students on campus. So we have moved into some of the trial phases where we're really trying to take these dynamic models and these models and dynamic pricing ideas to real customers. I'm going to finish up with one other model that relates to spoilage. We've also developed models to estimate consumer exposure to spoiled yogurt, where mold contamination is an issue. This was actually a model developed very specifically in request from one processor to try to identify the best intervention strategies. For example, what would different types of preservatives, natural preservatives versus more traditional preservatives, protective cultures that reduce growth of yeast and mold do to extend shelf life? So some real decision making drove us to develop this model for a specific processor. This shows the type of spoilage we're trying to model and reduce mold growth that is visible in yogurt. And this model, which is published was published in 2018, estimated again the baseline % of cups with visible mold, and then we used this model to predict what would happen with different type interventions, helping this firm to decide on the appropriate interventions to use in their products. So to the earlier questions, all of these different types of models can be used and have been used to help individual companies with making specific decision making for their specific site and their specific facilities. Now, in the next few final slides, I will sort of illustrate some further ideas and some work that we have done in terms of using models further along the food chain. One key component that we have not yet talked much about is how we can use GIS models, so global information system models, to predict the risks of pathogen contamination. Here we work on Listeria monocytogenes, but also the risk of spoilage that occurs later in the food chain on primary production. So this is a map that shows a number of different fields. These are actually fields owned by Cornell that have different locations. Some of the fields are in close proximity to a stream that is shown here. Some of them are in proximity to a road. Some of them are in proximity to pasture, etc. We used extensive sampling along with classification tree models as initial models, and then subsequently different types of models to further optimize or further develop these models to predict the likelihood of Listeria monocytogenes contamination in different field locations. This now provides individual farmers potentially with the ability to manage which type of products to grow in different locations. This type of more precise growing to manage food safety issues would work very well with some of the existing precision agriculture tools that are already being used to, for example, modify application of fertilizers to different parts of a field to be optimal for the environment. So this idea that I presented earlier today about the tools of precision agriculture being used in food safety is what can be done with these models. This is the agent-based model that Renata mentioned. This provides an opportunity to model food safety introductions and model interventions at the processing plant level, another important component of these comprehensive digital twins. So there's a lot, what I want to leave you with here is there's a large amount of individual tools available. We've seen it in the Listeria presentation, we've seen it in Renata's presentation, and I tried to illustrate this somewhat further here with some additional examples. The next frontier, as I see it, and as is outlined in this paper in Science, is to really integrate these models to get these, what I mentioned, what Renata mentioned, these digital twins that hopefully cover complete food chains all the way from farms through processors and retailers and consumers. Not just improving food safety and reducing food waste, but then truly integrating this with sustainability standards, food security standards, policy to really drive sustainable food consumption and production through digital tools. So with that, with this final presentation, I hope I've given you an idea, along with the other presentations we heard today, about the wide range of different types of models that are available to help industry and government agencies, which was particularly well illustrated in the Listeria presentations that we heard before mine, make food safety and spoilage decisions. The integration of these tools into more completely digital twins is what I see as one of the next frontiers. Implementation research and infrastructure for this is needed. And again, I want to leave you with this idea of a future where we build a more digital food infrastructure to facilitate application of these tools. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Lynn and open it up to any questions either on this presentations or in any of the presentations or the general topic area that we covered today. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. So again, if any of the attendees have questions, feel free to type it in the Q&A section or raise your hand or put it in chat. I don't see any questions, so I want to see if the panelists have, oh wait, let's see, there's something in Q&A now. Let's see. There's a question about global initiatives to share this data from different governments. Is there such a initiative?
I'm not aware of a lot of them in terms of global initiatives to share between different governments. I think a lot of the sharing I have seen would be in some of the more supplemental data that are used for the models. There's a decent amount of sharing, for example, on molecular subtyping data of pathogens that can feed into the risk assessments. The challenge with some of the data sharing also is that very often some of the data that are needed for risk assessment are somewhat country specific. I think Jingli pointed it out. The subtypes we find in China, maybe even in different regions in China, are different from the ones that we may find in the US and in other different countries. But I'm not really aware of that many data sharing initiatives at this point. I don't know, Renata, Jingli, whether you have anything to add there.
There is a group in UK that does data sharing, created like a safety hub that you mentioned earlier. I can't remember the name. That's the biggest one that I can think of.
Is it Combase you're thinking about?
No.
Okay.
Well, that's also another one, yes.
Combase is one example which shares a lot of sort of growth parameter data that could be useful. It's not government necessarily, but it is some sharing.
So in my opinion, like Combase is from UK, USA, now some Australian universities. Is not from government level. It's urgent if we can, combine all the data from different countries. It is quite useful in future. Yeah.
There's a question about digital infrastructure, the inputs and outputs, whether there is a model for this.
I'm not aware of specific models. I think there have been some ideas kicked around. So one example that I've heard about is the idea, for example, the Internet of Things, and people have kicked around the idea, the Internet of Water, for example, where you could imagine some of the inputs would be various sensors. So you could develop, part of this digital infrastructure could be development of improved sensors at, let's say, the water level, where you can measure turbidity, that can then predict microbial water quality, soil parameters. Some of it could even have to do with either satellite-based sensing or drone-based sensing to generate data that could create inputs for it. So that would be some of the ideas that would sort of facilitate and would be part of this digital infrastructure potentially that could be used to improve our ability to predict food safety issues and food spoilage issues. With regard to outputs, I'm going to look at my fellow panelists, whether you can help me with that, what the question might mean with that. I'm not quite sure how to interpret that.
So may I add something? Thanks the question from Mr. Shang. So in Chinese question, it is very good one. I think maybe for some like detection or investigation for government or food industry, it's needed just like a black box. It's only input some information or data can get some result. Actually, there's not there's no such just one combined model to link the input and output. But in my opinion, for the future research trend, it is very necessary for us to try to turn digital to a smart one, like some software. I think it's a quite a good example, like Google. You just input something. You don't need some algebra or calculation behind this input. So if we can, have this smart software or tool, it will a very good usage in the future. Yeah.
We have a question from Ralph.
Yes, very interesting presentations. And as I looked across all of the presentations, I noticed that there were different commodity selections, pork, beef, produce, milk. So my question is, how sensitive is the selection of the commodity or the supply chain to the data availability and also to the model itself? In other words, do certain commodities lend itself to certain data models, or does certain supply chain give you different data? Or it doesn't really matter. Are these models applicable across something, a wide spectrum that we can simply call food?
Oh, maybe I can get us started. That's a great question. And it, I think, goes off what Kingsley said about Google. And it's almost like Alexa, having Alexa to tell us everything about food safety in one place. Maybe we will get there. Who knows, maybe soon. Right now, most of the models are commodity specific, and not even that, they could be even part of the supply chain for that commodity specific. Maybe this is happening because for us to understand the big picture, we are starting from hypothesis driven research at a small scale, and then we are building from that. But the whole system has to be taken into account because there are many feedback loops and positive and negative. So it has to go there. Absolutely.
Thank you.
I think data availability also plays a role. I think it's even cultural to a certain extent. Different foods, different food chains have different levels of importance in different countries, right? I mean, one could hypothesize that in France, you find more data on different types of cheeses, while, you know, in other countries, other types of products might be more important for society. And therefore more data might be available there. It also sometimes involves which companies are involved, how much to share, how open they are to allowing research to be done and shared. So I think there are a lot of different drivers in terms of, you know, which types of commodities we are more likely to model and build models that are more advanced and more just have more data available to make them useful.
I don't see any other questions. Do the panelists have any questions for each other?
I would like to ask a question, maybe everybody here, but maybe in particular our Chinese colleagues, Kingsley. What is happening with education in this space of new digital tools? It might require, actually, I think in our experience, it requires a whole new generation of young scientists who would be cross-trained across engineering and math and food science and epidemiology. So how is that, what is happening in China?
Thank you, Renata. I have read many your good publications. So I think in China, it will change fast, and data gap is a good problem in China. There are also some software like IPMP from USDA and some other like iRisk from US FDA. So in my opinion, so for China, maybe there are not enough data. We try to build like a structure. When we have enough information, we can input all this data information. For me, I think I try to follow some good research publication from Martin and you. So maybe we can have a further discussion about how to have a good cooperation between China and the USA. So maybe make this theory or tools more useful and flexible. Yeah, thank you.
I think in the US, I see a slow change, and it's very acute. I just admitted the first PhD student to my lab who has an undergraduate degree in food science with a minor in data science. I had not seen that type of new students. So I think we're starting to see that. And I think often it's the students, the undergraduate students, the students themselves that drive their training. because we don't advise them to do, unfortunately we should, but we don't, to do minors in data science. I think, we've done a better job at the graduate education level to drive students to minor in data science or statistics or epidemiology or risk assessment. But I'm starting to see it really also happening at the undergraduate level. So I'm somewhat optimistic that we will see more students that can sort of carry the torch of this, so to speak.
I don't see any more questions. So I'd like to thank all our panelists and conclude our webinar, Digital Approaches to Reducing Food Waste and Improving Food Safety. Thank you all for joining us. And on behalf of Ralph Christie, Martin Liebman, Renata Ivanek, and the rest of our research team, we would like to acknowledge and thank the Walmart Foundation for their support of this research. And we are also really grateful and appreciative of our research collaborators and partners in China, Ximei Agricultural Science and Technology Company, and the lab of Dr. Zhang Liqun at China Agricultural University. Also, a big thank you goes out to Professor Dong Qingli for joining us today from Shanghai to share the work of his lab. And as mentioned earlier, our research team will be holding a second event later this year that will focus on the strategic management and public policy implications of our work on digital approaches to reducing food waste and improving food safety. We hope to see you all then.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you, Lynn. And maybe we should mention that, yes, the presentations are recorded and will be shared, and everyone who registered will get an email about that. Is that correct?
Yes.
Perfect. Cool. Okay.
Great.
Thank you all for attending, and feel
Wow.
free to reach out to any of us with any follow-up questions. All right.